hopefully, the rationale of our conference. I will just say a few words. Homage to the visibility of the translator, and the translator is more stentoriously and even outrageously visible and hearable than average. When she is there to be heard, or when he is so manipulative, please note my use of gender pronouns, when he's so manipulative that we cannot but acknowledge his presence. So I'm thinking, and I repeat the adjective outrageous because it is suitable. It is just what they wear. I'm thinking of the outrageous Italian dubbings, especially of the 1960s and 70s, in which renowned dubbing directors included references to topical political events and gave free vent to their opinions by bending and shaping the translated text to their authorial needs and, I'd say, whims. As deplorable as some of these operations were, leaving as they did the source text well behind, this conference is also a homage to them, to the audiovisual translators who do not want to shut up, who feel they have a right to declare their opinion through translation. I always like to mention an episode. I will mention Oreste Lionello, who is one of our famous famous and infamous dubbing directors. Once famously distanced himself from Woody Allen, who was translating live on national television, distancing himself from his atheist views and saying, okay, no, I believe in God, okay, live on national television. One would say, okay, who cares? But no, we translation scholars, we do care. We do care about his opinions, about his the opinions of a translator, okay? So this is also, as I said, perhaps homage is too big a word, but certainly an acknowledgement of creative translators, also in this sense of the word, when additions and rewritings literally give birth to afterlives which are independent from the hypertext. And that's all for me. And now the floor to Frederick Chaume.
Buongiorno. And I think that's the only thing I can say.
He's more relaxed, you see.
So first of all, I'd like to welcome you all to this convenio, translators as authors, especially in an age where machine translation and post-edition are like an omen for all of us there. I'd like to welcome our friends and colleagues from other universities, from other countries as well. Thank you for coming. Thank you for saying yes to our invitation. I also like to thank all the participants, also other colleagues from other countries as well. Welcome. All the participants as well, all the PhD students, all the MA students, all the BA students present here, all the people in Sapienza. It's really a pleasure for me to be here with my colleague, Professoressa Ranzato, on this table, right? Professoressa Ranzato, Irene, of course, and I'm really glad. I'm really happy to see this live because after 1.5 years of terrible Zoom and Meet and other platforms events, finally, in the end, we are here and we have made this possible. Thank you to all of you for coming and for making this possible. I am not speaking too much. I tend to speak a lot, but I just wanted to just show you some questions in order to spark the debate. So what Irene and myself did was, and I'm not sure whether, yes, now it works. Look at the curtains. Look at the curtains. You see? Okay. And okay. So what we did was preparing some questions just to spark the debate. Because as the authority said, and Irene was saying as well, creativity was there before. Creativity was there from the beginning, and we have a historical approach to creativity in audiovisual translation tomorrow. But we really need a new term, or translation is creative by itself? Do we really need it? Do we really need to coin a new term, creative audiovisual translation? Is it useful for academics? Is it useful for professionals? Is it useful for teachers? Isn't translation creative by nature? Is creative translation just the opposite to literal translation? Are we speaking about like a domesticating method of translation or something? Are fun subs and fun dubs, and we will have someone in Zoom speaking, Dr. Masida, hello, if you can hear us, about fun subbing and fun dubbing, and then our colleague, Dr. Bogucki as well. Cartoons in this case. Are machine translation and post-edition having an impact on creativity in audiovisual translation? Can we tell a creative translation from a non-creative translation? That is a tricky question, right? Was creativity a topic of interest in the past too? Can creative audiovisual translation be more effective to learn a language? And we have a paper on that, or to make our lives better in terms of healthcare, and we have another talk on that, or social change, and we have another talk on that. So what is really true is that I don't know, wait, it's that the industry is using the word creative as a buzzword. I don't know, probably why we can't. Yes, that's it, right? So the industry speaks about creative and creative and creative and creative. Creative choice. Netflix itself, they have a rubric, and they mark the translation according to that, the translations according to that rubric. Their rubric comprises about 40 items, 30 something items. One of them is creative change needed. So what do they mean by creative change needed? What are they asking for? Creative changes, creative elements, creative letters, in the guidelines, of course. Also, the professionals speak about creative strategies, creative translation techniques, creative something. And there is another interesting domain, accessibility. So accessibility is also mingled with creativity. So there are like two different sets that intersect somewhere. And finally, there is another thorny issue, another challenge, which is quality. Quality is also in the mouth of everyone, right? So quality, creativity, accessibility. So for example, this was this month, the Hollywood Reporter, November. Why are Netflix's subtitles so bad? And then the article speaks about quality, lack of creativity, and so on and so forth. So I think we have enough reasons to organize an event like this, and just to sort of maybe either highlight the role of creativity on the one hand in times of machine translation and post-edition, although we must be in favor of machine translation, we must be in favor of all technologies. We've been always in favor of all technologies in audiovisual translation. We've been always dealing with technologies. So we are not, I don't think we should be against any new technology, but how can we combine machine translation, post-edition, creativity? How can we combine accessibility with creativity? Is accessibility a proof of creativity? How can we combine quality with creativity? And that's just what I wanted to say. So Irene, thanks for making this possible, because although you can see my name and Irene's on all slides and on the program, it's been her, the only one in front of this. I think they're just supporting her like in the distance, but it's been her. So thanks, Irene, for making this possible, and we think we can declare this convention open.
Okay. Thank you very much.
We introduced our first speaker. Tú sabes la tuya, ¿no? No, a ver, es un punto. Sí, no había. Claro. It's 10 sharp, right? And we have our first speaker here with us, a very good colleague, and I should say also a very good friend as well. The first talk of this conference is about precisely accessibility and creativity. And it's something that we've been working together as well, right, Pablo? And it's really a fascinating topic, and I'm sure that you will all agree that we have the specialist here about accessibility and also about creativity. Most of you or all of you know him. You know Pablo Romero, but I will be professional and I will read his bio note. Pablo Romero Fresco is currently a Ramón y Cajal researcher at Universidade de Vigo, Galicia, Spain, and honorary professor of translation and filmmaking at the University of Roehampton, London. He is the author of the books Subtitling Through Speech Recognition, Respeaking, a seminal book, the seminal book on respeaking, as you all know, in Routledge, Accessible Filmmaking, Integrating Translation and Accessibility in the Filmmaking Process, in Routledge as well, and Creativity in Media Accessibility. So exactly our topic here, forthcoming. He's on some editorial boards, but especially I would like to mention the Journal of Audiovisual Translation, which maybe we all consider our journal, and the leader of the international research group GALMA with international impact, the Galician Observatory for Media Access, for which he's currently coordinating several international projects on media accessibility and accessible filmmaking, one of his specialties. Pablo is maybe less known, I don't know if in Spain he's also already known as a filmmaker at least, or I think also some in other countries as well. His first short documentary, Joining the Dots, was used by Netflix, as well as the film schools, as well as film schools around Europe, to raise awareness about audio description. He has just released his first feature-length documentary, Where Memory Ends, which has featured in El País and other leading Spanish media outlets. Pablo, thank you for accepting our invitation. Thank you for being here in spite of everything, that we know that these times are really difficult for everybody. So thanks for coming. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you here and to have you opening this convenio. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So for the talk today, I was planning to talk about, we've slightly changed the title and I've added a co-author, since Kate Dangerfield, who's a PhD student about to finish a PhD, has just co-authored an article with me on this. So it's fair to say that it's a joint presentation. Kate is a filmmaker and a PhD student on media access at Roehampton. So we would like to talk about new trends in media accessibility related to creativity, and how we move from the universal to the self, and present accessibility as a conversation. Is that okay? Is that okay now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. There we go. So I'd like to talk about the universal, the idea of the universal in film, in media access, and a new type of media access, which is called creative or alternative media access. We can discuss that. But let's start with the idea of the universal. In film, the universal has always been there. The idea of film is a universal language beyond translation, yeah? Even though we know that translation was always there. We know historically that in silent cinema, we had intertitles, we had interpreters conveying what the movie was about, plot modifications, and of course, when the sound came in, then multiple language versions, and then dubbing, subtitling, translation was always there. But the universal in film was so strong. I mean, translation should have challenged this idea of film as a universal language, right? Because the universality of the language of cinema is denied by the fact that there are languages there, right? So how can it be universal? But it didn't, because this idea of the universal is so convenient that it managed, in many ways, it managed to relegate translation to the distribution process, as we know, as an invisible notion. So translation is there, but this idea of a universal was too strong, right? So film was still sold as universal. And this was very useful because it became a tool to, as some people say, colonize the subconscious of multiple cultures. I'll explain this. To convey English as the language of cinema, we know this as well. To have a dominant and hierarchically unified worldview, which is the mainstream Hollywood view, if you like, and to transmit, to spread values and norms, what some people in disability studies now call what the normative citizen is. You know, they convey what the normative person is. And what is that? It's white, heterosexual, male, mobile, seeing, hearing, autonomous, law-abiding, mostly from Western Europe and North America. I mean, this is what we've been given, right? From Hollywood and mainstream, whether we like it or not, of course, right? I mean, and what is this exactly? What is it? It's pretty much this, isn't it? This is what has been conveyed. I know this well because I did my PhD on this and I really enjoyed it, but it is true that it's the norm, right? The norm. Okay, so not just that, the universal in film, some people say, help to deny difference because we almost, many film critics, for example, almost like pretend that films are received across cultural languages in the same way. So almost like translation didn't really matter. And if you do that, it's quite convenient because as the French theorists used to say, well, you know, their claims were seen as objective, even though they were accessing film through translation, through subtitling, for example, but they never actually studied and analyzed the impact that subtitling could have on the reception of the film. So it just didn't factor in, it was just there, which is convenient because that way I can claim something regardless of whether I'm watching the original or the translated version is fine, right? So universal in film, a strong force, no doubt. Some people say that it presents a reality that is subjective, fragmented, and artificial as objective, unified, authentic, and normative. That's what it has managed to do, right? Now, my interest here is what happens when we think about translation differently. I mean, people like Derrida say, well, there's no universality in translation. There's no perfect transfer of meaning. Translation is doomed to fail, yeah? And at best, it's a promise. Okay, we can promise that we will try to transfer meaning and culture, but can we really do it perfectly? Not quite, right? So let's leave this thought hanging here and I'll come back to it at the end to couple it with accessibility. So attempt to be universal, spreading values and norms, but even if you try to invisibilize translation, as we'll see in this conference, translation is always there. It's too noisy to be silenced, right? You'd think. Okay, so what happens in media access? Just like translation should challenge the idea of universal in film, media access should also do the same thing, just because if you need to make film accessible, then it means that it's not universal, right? You need to bridge that gap with a lot of people, then it's not universal, right? And yet, media access seems to have embraced this idea of universal as well. And we see it in here, ETV for all, you know, the whole for all idea, which is in projects, which is in publications and in conferences, right? This is very universal, for all, for all. We always say that media for all and all these things, right? And I see that, that there's a use in it. It's very efficient as a slogan, but this insistence on the universality of media access, is it really true? You know, what's this masking and excluding, no? So first, let me talk about the positives of the idea of universal media access, of all this for all, the positives. For me, the positive is that we managed to increase the quantity of media access, because see, when we talked to Netflix, for example, at the very beginning, they didn't have access. And one of our students at Roehampton was hired to start providing access and running the unit and everything. And we were asked to give them arguments which supported the idea of providing access. And for them, the strongest argument was access concerns all. Subtitles are being used not just by people with hearing loss, but 80% of the people who use them are not deaf or hard of hearing. And they are intralingual subtitles. So we know that access concerns all, and it's universal, and is being used by people with and without disabilities. So strong argument for platforms like Netflix to provide media access and increase the quotas. Great, we know that. So so universal is useful. And the universal has been useful for quality as well, I think, because as legislation was passed, as we produce new guidelines, those guidelines have been mostly based on scientific research, on eye tracking studies, on cognitive analysis. And in these ones, very often what we did is we've had reception studies where we asked a lot of people what they thought of how they processed subtitles. This means that the guidelines are a little bit more democratized, in the sense of they're more universal because they gather the views from more people or large groups of people. So there's almost a universal nature to the scientific research that is underpinning the new guidelines, right? So again, the universal has helped to increase the quality through new guidelines. So it's all good. Now let me focus on the negative aspects of this idea of universal, if I can. Is there anything bad about mainstreaming media access, about mainstreaming it for all? Well, there is, in the sense that some users are still excluded. Today, I'll show you a couple of examples, but deaf-blind people, for example, they're excluded. And that means that they are twice excluded. They're excluded from the original version of a film, and they're excluded from the accessible version that is meant to be for all. Now, being excluded from for all, it's a tough one. And some people with disabilities, you hear this in disability studies a lot. They say, when subtitles are for all, we're taking the risk of favoring the needs of the majority, that is the non-disabled, over the needs of the disabled. Think about speed. In Netflix, 20 characters per second. You know, that is quite good for the hearing people who use captions because they can read at that speed. But if you're a sign language user, you may not be able to read that fast. Then again, you're a minority, right? So, you know, who cares? So this universal thing, it's useful, but it has some risks as well. And in terms of quality, well, think about the eye tracking that I told you about. What do we do in eye tracking? We focus on this, right? Where most people are looking. But what about, and you know, we focus on what's common, on what's shared amongst most viewers, on what's universal. But what about this guy in there, you know, who's looking at the side of the screen? You know what that is in scientific terms? It's an outlier. That is data that are ruled out because they're not representative. But isn't media access all about including? And how can we exclude them, even if it's just 1% of the viewers, you know? But we do that in research as well, because it's not scientifically representative or statistically significant. But we have to look at those as well, you know? Okay, so Some users are still being excluded. We're being objective, yes. The guidelines are objective. They're homogeneous. The guidelines are quite homogeneous because they're like that. But for me, because they're homogeneous, they're also less creative in a way. Art doesn't have to be homogeneous, right? It's unique, it's different. So for me, this idea of universal is thinking of groups and concealing the individual nature of some things, for example, of the users, because we don't look at the users as individuals, but as groups. So who's being excluded? Second, professionals. If I train my subtitlers, I train them to the guidelines. So John and Peter would be equally good if they meet the guidelines and they produce something that is very similar. But how can I tell between John's and Pete's subtitles? Do they have a different style, an individual nature to them? Not really, they stick to the guidelines, right? So there's no individual there, there's no idiosyncrasy. And researchers, that's a different thing, but we tend to write in the passive voice. Our first person, our I, it's hidden as well, because we're being scientific for what we do. But who are we? What's our position in all of this? This is becoming an interesting debate where maybe exposing who we are, where we speak from, is actually quite important, especially if we're dealing with issues of related to disabled people and we're not disabled, you know. So again, we're concealing the individuality. That's what we're doing, okay? So just as the universal in film presents a subjective, fragmented, and artificial reality, as if it was objective, unified, authentic, and normative. In MA, accessibility is being presented as objective, as unified, as normative, yeah? But this is not always the case. So what I'm interested in for today is a whole new wave of people, mostly disabled, who are artists and writers, who are reacting against this. Now, I don't mean that the guidelines and media access that is provided now is not useful. I think it's great and really efficient, but there's room for something else as well to live with it. And this is what I'd like to mention today, some of these. So what is creative media access? It's those practices that don't only attempt to provide access for the users of a film, a play, or a live performance, but also seek to become an artistic contribution in their own right and to enhance the user experience or engagement, yeah, in a creative or imaginative way, right? So beyond just access, beyond comprehension, yeah. Now, this is an alternative approach to guidelines. There's no escaping from that. And I think the idea is that they are subjective. So in the guidelines, it's all about being objective and focusing on comprehension. Here, there's no shame in showing the subjectivity of the person who's providing the access, okay? Because I have a bias, I am who I am, and I'm providing access that is, you know, coming from me. Okay. In current guidelines, people like Raymond Antrobus, who's a deaf poet, he says that when he gets the captions with the description of a sound, he thinks that they come like the voice of God, you know? Who's the author there is hidden, it doesn't matter. I have to believe it, it's the voice of God, you know? Narrations of documentaries are often called voice of God. There's no authorial, yeah? Georgina Cleach, who's fantastic in audio description, she says, the illusion of objectivity is reinforced because the description is delivered without authorship, as if it represents some unassailable truth. I have to believe it because it doesn't come from anybody, right? It's so objective. Okay, so that's why creative media access, which draws so much on subjectivity, is also alternative media access because it's an alternative to the guidelines, okay? And three more things that I think are often there. Those are at the bottom of the slide, which are normally creative media access is considered during production, not at the end of a process, but in terms of like accessible filmmaking, you know, at the beginning, yeah? It's user-led. By user-led, I mean user-created. They're not just informing our practice, they're actually doing the practice themselves. And it's political because it's part of a wider fight for inclusion in society related to race and gender and other things. So I'll cover this. Okay, so an example. Yeah, Lisa Silvestre, she is a hard of hearing artist. And what she's done is she says, when I was attending school, I used to be exposed to loads of audiovisual material that was not captioned, and I'd be lost. I would be taking notes right? So now as an artist, what she's done is she's put together some clips from cartoons and films, and she's captioned them herself. But with the captions, what she's doing is she's talking to us. The captions don't tell us what the dialogue is saying. It tells us what she wants to tell us. So she sees this and she says, the sky still doesn't let me know what time of the day it is. As a deaf person, she's given us a window into her experience of exclusion from audiovisual media when you don't have access. Or she'll tell us, in the background, something's happening. Now, the interesting thing about this is that she's a visual person. We're always obsessed with how do we convey the sound to the deaf person, but what if the deaf artist, the deaf person is actually scrutinizing the visual, right? And while we look at the center of the screen, she looks at the background and she realizes that someone is about to steal the car. Well, she is the outlier here. She's the one looking on the sides, remember? With the eye tracking thing. We are the ones that are missing that maybe. And she says, I just realized that none of the characters on the screen are swaying with the movement of the train. And they should be. Maybe IMDb should hire hard of hearing people to catch those trivia bloopers, right? Of course, because as a deaf person, she's all about the visuals here. But are we aware of that when we provide access for deaf people? That first we should start from the visuals and we can get on what we can get from there. And what she does then is she describes images. She says, she smiles knowingly. Their homes have similar colors, dark grays and blues and hunter greens, with light sources breaking up the dark shapes. We see her through her furniture, which feels intimate. Now, isn't she not giving us an audio description almost? She's describing images. So wouldn't it make sense to have someone like her, deaf person, providing audio description because she's all about the images? Can we have blind people providing the descriptions of sounds and subtitles? Maybe we need new ways of thinking about these things, right? More creatively. And by the way she describes this image, which feels intimate, that's subjective. Yeah, because why is she going to follow guidelines anyway? You know, it's her. All this, you know, this is all unapologetically subjective. It could only come from her, and that's just fine, right? Just as a film comes from a director as well. And of course, she tells us more. She says sometimes whole conversations and relationships happen over the phone. I've not been able to hear well enough to talk on one since high school. And then she says, I sometimes feel entirely cut off from pop culture. And I'm left wondering how to make connections when I don't share the same content. So this idea of not sharing the same world is going to be picked up by someone else now. So that's one example I want to show you. Another one, I'll start to introduce it with this quote, which I find very interesting, by a deaf artist who says, many times I feel captions are intended to raise a deaf or hard of hearing person's understanding of sound up to a hearing person's experience. And she says, this is incredibly limiting because I don't know many hearing people who think about sound in as profound way as deaf and hard of hearing must do. So their experience is not an experience of silence. It's not that. You know, they experience sounds, they feel sounds in different ways, but I'm not sure we're always aware of that. An example is this wonderful artist, Kristen Sung Kim, profoundly deaf. First thing she did was she gave some film clips to deaf people and asked them to subtitle them. And they subtitled the sounds, and they didn't do it as per the guidelines. For example, frenetic silence, that's quite a subjective description of a sound. Regret swells, or the sound of a problem that is not a problem. Yeah. Now, you wouldn't even use the sound of. You're always told, don't use the sound of because they don't have sound. Well, they do. They feel the sound. They live in the same world. So they feel the absence or presence of sound, right? So drawing on this, she made a film called Closed Captions, which she herself captions. She created the images and she captions it herself. And she says, because, you know, most of the time captions are made by people who don't share the same experience of the world that I do. So let me just do my own captions here. And she has images like this one, where you see a half open door. Maybe there's a conversation there. Maybe some people are angry. I don't know. And she says, whispered conversation. Words throwing punches, or the sound of hurt feelings coming over. Now, what is she doing here? We don't know. She's probably adding a layer of poetry to an already poetic clip that she has created, but she's just breaking loose from the shackles of audio of guidelines-based accessibility and going somewhere else with it, you know, because she decides to do that. And then she has done this about a few weeks ago. She was commissioned by the Manchester Film Festival to leave her imprint into the city somehow. And this is what she decided to do. Okay. Oh, can you see the massive caption on the side of the building? The sound of architecture, trying to fit in with history. So she's left captions all over the city that comment on different things. Like, for example, let's see if I can get there. The sound of big things going over your head on a boat. The sound of buildings counting cars on the facade of a big building. This is something that everyone is going to be exposed to. The sound of agreeing never to call it soccer on the National Football Museum. Piccadilly Station, the sound of patting yourself on the back for being on time, right? Or at the side of a museum, the sound of ignorance crumbling. Now, the interesting thing about this is that she is turning the tables. She's bringing her deaf world into our world and leaving the footprint on our cities, right? So this is a bit of a revolution that is taking place now. You have people who are doing the same thing with audio description, thinking completely outside the box. How do we audio describe dance? I don't know if we have sound for this one. Sound is gone, I think. I don't know. Well, what he was saying here is that normally in dance, you have a description that is the dancer moves up and raises his hand and does this and that, right? That's the audio description. But he says, can we do it through sound effects and beatboxing? And so he goes. Now, that may or may not work for a lot of people, but it was created by blind people who said, let's agree on the beatboxing sounds that are going to represent the movements of the dancers. And then let's do that as opposed to description. And this is working both ways. So now you have whole classes of blind people who are dancing to beatboxing sounds because they agree on their vocabulary, but there's no words being used there, right? I mean, may like it or not, but all these people that I'm showing you here, this is a whole movement of artists. You can find them in here, Disability Arts International. You even have a database where you can just search for disabled artists who invariably have to deal with access. So like I said, you know, look at all this, there's all sorts of initiatives, dance, film, any other art, of people who are approaching access in a different way. Like Karen Lazar says, she says, conversations about disability normally rely on a set of particular preset interventions. She says, access is malleable and it shifts in real time. We cannot account for every need for every person. Accessibility is a promise, not a guarantee. It's speculative practice. This idea of promise was the idea that I mentioned about translation as well, yeah? It's flexible. So to finish with, who is still excluded from all of this? Well, deafblind people, for example. You have here someone called John Lee Hooker, and he's fantastic. He's a deafblind poet. The way he communicates is through touch. He can't see or hear, but sign language, yeah? And if someone is signing, he'll be touching and he'll be able to follow, yeah? And also there's back channeling with this. He has to touch a lot and say, oh yes, yes, I understand that. And he'll be doing this to say yes, for example, right? So it's all about touch. Now it's all about touch in an era with a pandemic where touch is not allowed. Yeah, but it's all about touch. Okay. He wrote a wonderful essay called Against Access, super provocative. And he says, well, access services are all about, I mean, obviously he says they're very useful and they're life-saving, but they always revolve around the assumption that there's only one world. Yeah. He says, why is it always about you, non-disabled people? Why is it about you including us and not us including you? Yeah. Why is it always a ramp where, in this case, deafblind people have to access our world and not the other way around, right? He says, I began to understand why there's so much things about accuracy. This commitment to accuracy, to perfect replication, is a commitment to the status quo. We are expected to leave everything untouched, not altered, to do as little as possible. So non-reciprocal assimilation, don't transform things, right? Just leave it as they are, but provide a ramp to them. And he gives us an example, which I thought was great. In April 2020, a journal asked him as a poet for a photograph and an audio description of a photograph, yeah? But he says, no, I'm not going to give it to you because why should I provide a headshot, a picture, as if I knew what it conveyed, and as if I knew what I'm supposed to convey with it? You know, this is not my world. It's not my world. So he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you a tactile description, which suggests what it's like to touch me in person. And he did that, and he created a research group called the Tactile Research Group. And if you go on the website, there's no pictures. There's just tactile descriptions, which means, yeah, he describes himself as this: hair of feline softness, warm and smooth hands, a scent of patchouli, flutters betray his exhilaration. Or another researcher wears fashionable textured attire, wiggles her fingers on you when she's deep in thought, yeah, when she's signing. When you talk to her, you feel a steady stream of taps and squeezes. Sometimes when she's really excited, she slaps you. Engage at your own risk. So this is a description of their world as it is. And if you want to get to know this poet, then you enter their world, right? So access as not just a one-way ramp, but as a two-way process, right? A conversation, not a monologue. So finishing now then. The universal then is tempting because really the universal can help us escape the messiness of life. Yeah, it's quite a convenient idea, but it doesn't always work. It's useful to convey values and norms. It can increase quantity and quality of media access. Yes, I'm sure it does. And it helps us have guidelines, yes, which are objective and unified and scientifically based. And Media for All is there, and it has been useful. I think it has been useful. I'm not knocking it, but I think it conceals the individuality, you know, of users, because we don't look at the individual users, of professionals, because we don't let them be individuals, idiosyncratic, subjective, creative, and researchers. I am, you know, remember that list of adjectives? Hey, male, heterosexual, blah, 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 blah. I was looking at that and I was thinking, check, 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 check. As far as I'm concerned, right? So I've not been discriminated against for all those things that leave you out. And I speak from that position, from one in which I've not been discriminated. And I'm talking about people who have. So, you know, I can only speak from my position. And I think I shouldn't hide behind the passive voice, you know, when I'm writing, because it matters. That matters, I think. So can we target individual users who are the outliers? Can we encourage idiosyncratic practices from our students? Can we look at all this disability art that is happening? Because otherwise we're turning our backs to reality. Can we ask the researchers to consider the role of media access, but their own role in society as well? What's our role? I mean, you know, what kind of collaboration should we have with people with and without disabilities for all of this? And can we go then from the universal to the self, as in to rethinking our, if access is changing so much, this is happening, right? I mean, I showed you all these examples. Then unless we change, but we really change, unless we go through this journey as well, then I'm not sure we can teach it and train it, you know, because it is a journey that has to take plays insight as well in terms of our preconceptions of how things work and who they're made by and for. It's not just access for all and media for all, it's media by all as well. And that's a whole change of conception. I like this quote. First, let me just get to this. Yeah, media for all then, of course, is very useful, but I think it's useful as a goal, as a path to follow, yeah? So access can be a promise, a two-way process, yeah? A proper conversation, meaningful conversation with everyone or as many people as possible sitting around the table. And willing to address three questions that I'm going to leave you with here, yeah? So media for all, yes, but can we consider three questions? One is, who is still excluded? Yeah. The other one is, who gets to create and decide? Is it just us or is it everyone? So second question. And the third question is, what is my position in all of this? I think that as long as we consider these three things, then we are rethinking access and rethinking our role in all of this. And I do want to leave you with a quote that I found fascinating, which is, the Queensland Aboriginal Activist Group put it best. If you come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Yeah. So this whole idea of helping, I'm not sure is going to work. Not with the examples and the artists that I was showing you, but a meaningful collaboration where we are willing to enter a different world, willing to rethink our ideas, rethink our practices, then this could maybe work. And the example that I often show is, do I have 2 minutes?
Yes,
I do. You do. Okay. I'm just going to give you a very quick example and see if. Okay. Hopefully. Let's have a look at this ad. Okay. 2 minutes. It's a commercial made by Toyota. Super inspirational. Okay. About a disabled. Do we have an internet connection here?
Yes,
We do. Okay, because then it's easier. This one has.
to open it from, right?
Because it has
Okay.
subtitles, so if the sound is not too good, then people can watch it like that. I'm going to accept. So there we go. That's the one with subtitles. Right. So this was super influential and inspirational for a lot of people. But when it comes to the disabled community, a lot of people hated it. What they said was, wait, look, what are we seeing here? We're seeing, at the beginning, we're seeing darkness. Yeah, the darkness of the darkness from which she has to come out. Okay, this disabled person, medical, the whole idea of where you are and that kind of thing. You can swim your way out of that darkness into the able world. And you do so by learning how to maybe walk. Yeah. But first time you see this, she's not walking by herself. She's walking towards her mom, and her mom being the main focus here. Question is, who's the focus in this ad? Then she managed to keep swimming and find the recognition of some people, and then massive recognition at Olympic level. And at the end, we see this shot, which is very meaningful. Now, from a disability studies point of view, this is known as a super crip. Super crip means handicapped people, people with disabilities, who are presented as super women, super men, because they have to overcome their disability, right? You swim, you become a hero, and then you become a hero who can inspire us, non-disabled people. And how do we know that the focus is on us? The focus is on, look at the shot. I mean, just look at this shot. She's managed to come out of the darkness. She's managed to become a superwoman. And then when she gets there, she gets to a living room where she is occupying the lower bottom of the screen. You don't even see her face. Does she talk at all? No, she doesn't talk. She doesn't have a voice. But the important thing here is mom and dad saying, it's okay, we're going to be fine. We'll do the job, right? And so this is what a lot of people talk about as inspiration porn, which is ads made by non-disabled people to inspire non-disabled people, but using disabled people as a problem. So it is a very harsh way of looking at it. Maybe it is, but you know, this is what's going on. And there was one disabled person who watched this ad and said, it's not just that you are using us as props to inspire you. It's also that this is making me feel like shit, she said. Because if I have the same condition, I have no legs, what is this telling me? Do I have to become an Olympic swimmer, Paralympic swimmer to actually, you know, like fully realize myself? Because, you know, what are the chances of people doing what this woman has done? You know, what are the standards that this is setting us up to, you know? So why are we talking about this example? Because most of the representation of disabled people in audiovisual media is made by people like us, people without disabilities. So again, it's a world made by people without disabilities, for people without disabilities. And when you see the art and the media access provided by people with disabilities, you're thinking, it's not just about adding creativity. It's about a new way of thinking, really. It's about rethinking who we are. And that's why I think, yeah, these three questions, including what is my position in all of this, right? And you can't just have collaboration. My question is this creative? I mean, if we look at this guy and the quote, is this creative? Well, it's creative from my point of view as a non-disabled person because I've never seen it. But for them, it's not creative, it's normal. This is how they are. So maybe it's just alternative media access as opposed to creative. But what it is rethinking access, I think. And this is what we try to do. Rethinking access, rethinking our position, and then deciding whether we want to collaborate meaningfully with them, as opposed to just help. There's no help needed there. Anyway, thank you very much. Sorry.
No, that was really necessary. We still have time for some couple of questions from the floor. Maybe we need coffee before, but still we have to wait still a little bit more. But what do you think? Any question? Any? Yes, please.
The last part, like not creativity, but changing the way of thinking, I get it. Like, because I've been studying this area to get better in my work, to open up my point of view. And I see how we don't include everybody because we think from our perspective, etc. But creativity, this is a problem. I have a problem with this word, you know. Also the presentation, because if I add my creativity, if I add my point of view, if we do it at production stage, then I get it, because whoever is thinking now, it has can intervene. But if I do it at my stage, then I'm adding layers of meaning that were not intended, and then that is tricky.
Yeah, and maybe you get in trouble as well. No, all this that I'm showing you. So you have the two ways: the traditional standard way, if you like, and then the increasingly creative, subjective, alternative way. The latter, the subjective, alternative, I think all the examples that I'm showing here are from production. They really are. Yeah. Whether they are made by disabled people or not, they are made in an accessible filmmaking manner. So in collaboration with the creators. And that's when it's almost like subjectivity is impossible to avoid, because you are dealing with several subjectivities. The one of the director, the one of, your own subjectivity. It's a conversation. So normally when we film, we're working a lot with filmmakers and creators, and normally we just have the guidelines as a basis, and because they don't know access. So we show them these are the guidelines. They read them and they say, fine. And now what can we do? What can we build on top of it? And then inevitably your subjectivity is valued and encouraged. The only thing, of course, is that you're used to having your way when you work in a traditional way, because you don't have to deal with anyone else, you decide. Here you don't. Here you have your views, but they may or may not be accepted by the filmmaker. As for your question of how can I be creative at the distribution stage without collaboration, that's much more tricky, because it depends on what you're allowed to do, of course. So I would always encourage people to look for areas, places, projects where you can work from the beginning. And there's a lot of people doing that these days. But it's mostly in film festivals, independent filmmakers, theater makers, loads of them, artists in live performances, things like that.
Yeah. I think starting from our perspective, how disabled people with disability see things that can improve our work, even within a set of guidelines.
Yeah.
Of course. But there are limits to what we can,
of course,
subjectively do.
Definitely. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other question? Still have time for maybe a second question. Yes, please, Marga.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Very tricky. I agree. I think what I was referring to, you're right about hard of hearing people, and also because hard of hearing people, they use sound quite a lot, and they use subtitles to check that they have heard correctly. So any kind of editing, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but any kind of editing could be tricky, because so then they would, in theory, favor fast subtitles. But then you also have other groups, right? Like, for example, deaf-blind people many of them are partly deaf and partly blind. Then if you're a sign language user, profoundly deaf and sign language user, you're reading your subtitles in your second language, right? And we've got quite a lot of research showing that sometimes the reading skills are not quite as fast as. So then 20 characters per second becomes quite a challenge to read. But of course, 20 characters per second is good for Netflix because it's cheaper, isn't it? There's less editing. Your subtitles, the subtitler produces them faster, therefore you pay less. So we've known this for a long time, that the faster the subtitles, the cheaper they are, the more affordable they are. I don't know, it's a tricky one. Look, Kate Dangerfield has just finished a film that she made with deafblind people. So they were filming, she was filming. And the other day, yesterday actually, she gave me a call and said, I'm about to finish it, I'm subtitling it, and I have a problem, which is sometimes they speak too fast. They themselves, the deafblind people, speak too fast. Now she has to make the film accessible. And because they speak so fast, she was saying, what do I do? Do I edit down what they're saying and therefore change what they're saying? Or do I subtitle it at 22 characters per second? And many other deafblind people are not going to be able to read it. You know, and she said, what's the solution? And I said, I have no idea. I really have no idea. Maybe in some shots you can have 3 lines of subtitles, leave them for longer. But other than that, either you alter what they say or you don't alter it, but you leave some people out. Well, then we go back to what we said before. You know, you cannot provide access for everyone. You know, it's failure is a part of it. You know, I think here I don't want to be dogmatic. On the contrary, what I'm saying is guidelines are set in stone, but we cannot set anything in stone here. So she'll have to make a decision. And she's actually providing different types of access for different people. That's what she's doing because she has the time. So she will provide different types of subtitles, for example, more or less literal, depending on who's going to access it. Because she's a filmmaker herself and she decides to do that, you know? And I'm seeing how a lot of these artists are giving you 5 types of access, for example, 2 types of audio description, just because they want to. So these things that we always wanted broadcasters to provide fast and slow subtitles, and we never managed to get it. maybe we'll never manage to get, you know, I think I'm giving up on Netflix in a way of, I went there and gave them a workshop and we worked on about all this, but it's a mammoth, isn't it? It's huge. How can you change practices? That's very difficult. But when you talk to a small institution and filmmakers and people like that, they can do that. And that's why they're the ones deciding to provide several types of access, which are more personalized. So it's universal design meets personalized design. So, you know, maybe that's a way of doing things. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we need another conference to decide how to pay for all this, because yes, because who is paying for all these, no? For all these other possibilities, not for the universal one, because it was really interesting, no? to deconstruct the universal approach to accessibility. But the next question is, how can we put this into practice? No, at least alternatively, yeah, they are. Anyway, I think we must stop. Although we could be speaking and speaking, we must stop here to welcome our second speaker. So Pablo, thanks for your talk. Thanks for coming. Check because this is the video. Pablo's video. Okay. And no. Can you check if it is here? Here.
You sent it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's there.
Okay, perfect. Now there. So we now have what we could call a talk about creativity par excellence, because we now are we're moving into cartoons, into a genre that is creative in itself. It's inherently creative. And our next speaker is Professor Łukasz Bogucki from the University of Łódź. And with a talk entitled Polish Dubbing of Animated Films, Is Creativity Always the Way to Go? Łukasz Bogucki is currently Vice Rector for International Relations at the University of Łódź in Poland and Head of the Department of Translation Studies and Language Pedagogy at the Institute of English Studies in that university. Between 2012 and 2020, he was head of the institute. Łukasz is a linguist whose main research areas are audiovisual translation studies that we all know, computer-assisted translation and interpreting studies. He has published 5 monographs and about 70 papers. He's co-editor of the Peter Lang series, Wood Studies in Language. He was previously on the board of the Journal of Specialized Translation, Jostrons. Lucas, Professor Bogucki, welcome to Sapienza. Many thanks for coming, despite everything as well, despite all the circumstances that we all know, and the floor is now yours.
Introduction. I'm so happy to be here in the Eternal City. An online conference would have been good, but this is so much better. It's so much better to be here. Speaking after Pablo, he's always a challenge. He's an excellent speaker and he sets the bar rather high. So I'll try to keep up with the standards that are now established. In addition, I have a rather frugal presentation with no visuals. So it looks like I'm doomed, but I'll do my best. Thirdly, to be honest, I am not a dubbing researcher. My area is mostly the theory and methodology of audiovisual translation, and the modality that I focus the most on is subtitling. So here I am in a dubbing country talking to dubbing specialists, a little bit out of my element, but where I have the advantage is that I come from Poland, which is a peculiar place in the world of audiovisual translation, both in terms of theory and practice. And I'll try to demonstrate to you, as to the best of my knowledge, there are no other Polish people here in the audience, how we differ from the rest of the audiovisual world. So I won't try to reinvent the wheel, talking about dubbing, telling you the things you already know. So I'll probably raise more questions than answer them. But I hope that you can take something home from this presentation when the time comes for the conclusions. So in terms of research, Poland appears to be a fairly strong research center when it comes to audiovisual translation. Many of you personally know Agnieszka, Ania, Bona, Mikołaj, yours truly perhaps as well. So there is quite a bunch of people who have been quite active in the world of AVT. You are familiar with the Journal of Audiovisual Translation, which is Ania Jankowska's brainchild. It has been mentioned here already today. You should be familiar with the intermedia conferences that I started, the series of intermedia conferences I started some time ago. When it comes to the practice of audiovisual translation, we are lucky, or perhaps we have the misfortune, depending on how you look at it, to have all the 3 major modalities of audiovisual translation: subtitling, dubbing, and what we rather imprecisely refer to as voiceover. It's not the kind of voiceover you will get on BBC. It's a little bit different. A few words about that later. We actually started out as a dubbing country, even before the Second World War. And the dubbing in Poland at that time and after the Second World War, because for obvious reasons there was not much happening in the 1940s, was considered to be particularly good quality, good translations, well-trained voice talents. That's what we were famous for. Incidentally, the dubbing instructions, the tuition, mostly came from specialists in the Soviet Union due to the political climate we were in at that time. It sort of ended around 1989, because that was when the political system collapsed and made way new budding democracy. And also, this was the year of the tragic demise of a certain Zofia Dybowska-Aleksandrowicz, who was a famous dubbing director, producer, and animator. So this resulted in a decline of dubbing in Poland and bad quality productions in the 1990s. The Canal Plus television network made a point of that at that time to make all the three modalities available to viewers. So there were three options you could choose from. You could toggle between dubbing, subtitling, and voiceover. But this turned out to be cost prohibitive, and the most expensive modality, which is obviously dubbing, had to be eliminated, leaving just subtitling and voiceover. But as you can see here on the slide, once a dubbing country, always dubbing country. We still have dubbing, a particular variety of it, which is actually the focus of my talk, but on that later. We are also a self-professed world champion, if I may say so, of voiceover, in the version that we have, which is quite peculiar to Poland. For those of you who are not familiar with it, we also call it the lector's version. It's like half dubbing in a sense. It's revoicing, but with just one voice, regardless of who is speaking. There's even this famous article from the 1990s from the New York Times, why Marilyn Monroe is a Polish baritone. Because regardless of the sex, it's one profound, deep, booming male voice. I will show you a reception study later as to why voiceover is still popular in Poland. There are several reasons. I personally think it's a defective mode of audiovisual transfer because it's not as natural as dubbing. It is not as inconspicuous as subtitling. So to my mind, it has more disadvantages than advantages. But there obviously is a strong trend towards subtitling in Poland as well as in many other places in Europe. I am not sure about Spain and Italy, you tell me, but I hear that even in Germany, which is another strong dubbing country, people are slowly but surely switching to subtitling as cheaper, easier to make, and well, preferred in amongst many audiences. Now, in a recent reception study that Mikołaj Deckert and myself penned a couple of years ago, we made a survey amongst approximately 150 recipients, all of them students of various courses of study, languages, English, Italian, sociology. They were all Polish, aged between 18 and 28, roughly. And the majority, approximately 2/3, said that the modality that was closest to original, so perhaps you could say the least creative in a sense, was subtitling. Voiceover came second and dubbing came last, so just 11% people said that dubbing was the closest to the original, with nearly 9% people claiming that there was no difference between the dubbings. In terms of the cognitive effort required to process the information, quite obviously subtitling was the number one, with a nearly 94%. So the claim being made here was that the additive nature of subtitling put the audience to extra cognitive effort, having to process the subtitles as evidenced in eye tracking studies, for example. In dubbing, very little, next to no cognitive effort, extra cognitive effort was observed. People just thought that this is pretty much like processing the original, with just a minimum of cognitive effort noticeable in the case of voiceover, where I beg to differ because I think that there is quite significant cognitive effort required when you process voiceover, in particular if you are familiar with the language of the original. Because if you're not, you sort of obliterate the original, you don't focus on it. But if it's English that you speak and Polish voiceover, you tend to listen to both of them and become quite confused. The question, which modality a given, which modality is best for a given type of audiovisual text, subtitling was chosen for feature films, with just under 8% believing that dubbing is best for feature films. A staggering 87% was chosen to be the best modality for animated films, which are the focus of this talk. For documentaries, it was voiceover. And for sitcoms, subtitling was the method of choice, but there was, this was just a little more than half of the audience. So the differences were quite perceivable in terms of subtitling for films, dubbing for cartoons and animated productions, and voiceover for documentaries, which is incidentally what tends to happen in the practice of audiovisual translation in Poland. So you get a particular modality depending on the type of audiovisual production that is broadcast. Some comments from the participants of that survey. The first one is probably the most important one from the point of view of this talk, creativity and perhaps over creativity. Dubbed comedies may even be better than originals. So they are more humorous, they are funnier, they could constitute an improvement on the original, just because they are dubbed and because of the way how they are dubbed, at least in Poland. Time is not of the essence, so it is possible to render more than in the case of subtitling. So the time and space constraints in subtitling mean that in the case of dubbing and voiceover, you can translate more, which is perhaps not entirely the case, because we all know that there are constraints of a different type. Still, there are constraints on dubbing as well, for example, lip sync. Dubbing is the method of choice for young audiences. In the case of teenagers or adults, subtitling should be used, or best of all, the original version. There were some comments on actually preserving the original, as an increasing number of young people in Poland speak English, so they would prefer for there to be no audiovisual translation at all, rather than just rather listening just to the original. As opposed to voiceover, dubbing lacks the structure of the original dialogue. This is the main difference, and it has been pointed out here. Dubbing replaces the original. Voiceover does not. Voiceover is superimposed on the original. The effect of domestication could be extremely funny. There are examples to follow. All Polish viewers are so used to Krystyna Czubówna's voice. Now, you are not familiar with the person, but she does the voiceover of documentaries, and her voice is instantly recognizable. Which is interesting because with this exception, for voiceover that we have on television, feature films are exclusively, as I said, translated by males. We do have a range of voices that we recognize. The audience here is quite young, so you may have forgotten a certain Ferruccio Amendola, who I am told was the #1 most recognizable voice in his time in Italy. So you could consider Krystyna Dżubowna to be a Polish equivalent of that, a voice that sort of sticks with you and a voice that you would not replace with any other. Dubbing is the most attractive form for children, the main audience of animated productions. Cartoons should only be broadcast with dubbing as it brings out the character. I still believe that subtitles may be beneficial for children who can learn a foreign language watching a cartoon at the same time. So this is a different voice saying that while dubbing is, and perhaps should be, the default choice, subtitling has advantages as well, because you can watch a foreign language listening to the original and looking at the subtitles, which is evidenced by some research, for example, in Scandinavia, where people used to learn foreign languages because of Scandinavian countries being mostly subtitled countries. And as long as actors' faces are clearly rendered, there is no impression of unnaturalness in dubbing. From an article in Jostrans, co-authored by Agnieszka Szarkowska, this table answers the question whether domestication makes dubbing more accessible. And out of 201 respondents, nearly half of them said definitely yes, and nearly 40%, another 40% said yes. So very few people actually said that domestication has no influence on the accessibility of dubbing. Obviously, it's not accessibility in the sense of media accessibility for the impaired, but making it more digestible, if you will, and easier to listen to. So what about creativity? Another Polish name to learn, as your homework today, is Bartosz Wierzbięta. He is the man responsible for the Polish dubbing of Shrek. It was exactly 20 years ago. And he is widely considered to be the agent of change in Polish dubbing, as if the new wave of Polish dubbing. He is one of very few non-literary translators who have become celebrities. He is invited to all kinds of talk shows and gives interviews and whatnot because of what he did with Shrek and because of the people he invited to be the dubbing cast of Shrek. Now, you are familiar with the term dubbies, which is like translationese or legalese. And this is considered to be the bad language of dubbing in the sense that it's not natural. The constraints of dubbing influencing the naturalness of the language. Sometimes dubbies was said in the literature of audiovisual translation to be present in Italian, Spanish dubbing. It's not the case in Poland. We do not have that. We strive for maximum naturalness at the cost of faithfulness. So domestication and adaptation are the two keywords here. To quote Venuti and his seminal work on domestication and foreignization, what we are doing in Poland is trying to achieve the narcissistic experience of recognizing our culture in the other. So the adjective narcissistic, polonizing the dubbing, making it nearly nationalistic, departing from the original and creating a version that sits very much at home with the Polish audience, but very often has quite little to do with the original. You are familiar also with the dichotomy of overt versus covert translation, Julian House, because dubbing is covert translation, pretend to be the original, and when you take a cartoon or an animated production like Shrek, for example, happening in some kind of artificial reality, and there are no visual clues to suggest otherwise, if a very young person went to see the Polish dubbing of Shrek or any other dubbing of Shrek, they could believe that Shrek was in fact a Polish movie or an Italian movie or a Spanish movie. It's very easy to trick people. So the question I'm asking here is about authorship, also in the context of literary translation, which I am again not a specialist on, but the question is what liberties can the translator take? Shrek is an example of crossover, of a crossover audiovisual text. You may be familiar with the term crossover fiction, for example, Harry Potter. So it is intended at children, but very much enjoyed by adults. Shrek, I think, is a good example of a crossover animated movie. 3 generations can enjoy it, but the thing is that the 3 generations laugh in different parts of the movie. They find different parts funny. Children will not appreciate the same fragments as grandmothers will. And when you add extreme creativity to it, and when you add changes to the original, you run the risk of the respective generations still enjoying, still laughing at even different places than the original. Creativity, by the way, is, I think, a strong vehicle for humor rendition, and compensation appears to be a popular technique in humor rendition, in the sense, at least in Polish dubbing, in the sense that if you find something untranslatable or unfunny in translation, you add the funny element elsewhere, so that the overall effect remains the same, going back to the seminal approach by Maida and Tabor. So in terms, again, coming back to Venuti, in terms of visibility, the translator's visibility or invisibility, when you think of Polish dubbing, I think the expression that Irene used at the beginning of this conference, outrageously visible, okay, it is the translator is outrageously visible in the Polish dubbing. He or she, well, usually he, if it's Bartosz Wierzbieta, who has done a lot of these translations, has very much made an imprint on the target text. Some examples here from Polish, which I will not overburden you with, seeing as you do not speak the language, but these are some of the techniques of translating culture-specific elements that are observable in Polish dubbing. Naturalization, creation. This is from Cars, from the movie Cars. The place name Radiator Springs, and then changed into Radiation Stinks, was translated into Polish to preserve this, creating place names which sound as if they were Polish, but made reference to machines, cars as well. And then you have a travesty of that for the pun. So similarly, as in the title of the movie, Die Hard and then Spy Hard, it's the same mechanism here. Neutralization, Grand Central Terminal is just translated as Central Station, so neutralized. Domestication, Antipesto sounds in Polish as if it was an insurance institution or agent that would deal with the extermination of pests. Casa della Taes, Italian restaurant from the movie Cars, was perhaps even improved on in translation. Casa della Guma sounds very Italian and very understandable for Polish audiences. Third Lord of the Flame, literally translated as basically means the same in Polish, and brings out references to Lord of the Rings. But there is also, very briefly, the phenomenon of cultural contamination. So over creativity, whereby you contaminate the original with cultural references which are not there and perhaps shouldn't be there, or perhaps the question should be asked whether it is appropriate to include them. Allusions to a very popular Polish actor's characteristic style used to create a comic and familiar effect. The entire passage in Polish here is added to the Polish dubbing. It's not there in the original to imitate the style of the actor who does the voice of, in this case, the donkey from Shrek. Polish dishes included in the translation, missing from the original. Polish cartoons and films, Polish songs, names of Polish politicians from that era. Life in the communist times, quite interestingly, even though it was 2001 and the communist times were over by then. So all of these, I'm not translating them into English, sometimes it's very difficult to, are cultural references which are generically Polish and which are missing from the original. They were never there, and there was nothing really to base them on. They are the dubber's creation. So Polish dubbing is adapting the source version to the reality of Polish viewers, making them feel at home and creating the impression as if they were actually watching a Polish, generically Polish cartoon or animated film. Eliminating foreigners almost completely for the sake of the audience. But traces of the foreign may remain in the other semiotic channels. If it's Shrek and if you have no references to New York or Rome or Madrid or what have you, then it's fine. But if it's a different cartoon which is set somewhere, you will have traces of the foreign remaining in the other semiotic channels. I haven't noticed that it influences the choices of the translator in any way. It's just something that is there in the other semiotic channel. Despite over-domestication, the ultimate goal of the Polish dubbing is attractiveness and marketability of the target version. So you could compare it to localization in a way. It's producing a product that is marketable in Poland, very often unfaithful in terms of what translation is should be about, but easy to sell. So what can you take home from this talk, not being Polish? Well, imagine that in the country that I come from, we have an extreme orthodox version of dubbing, still not being a dubbing country per se, that is mostly the preserve of animated productions and cartoons. It's borders on adaptation, it's free translation, it departs considerably from the original. So the question that I would like to ask to finish this conversation is, to finish this presentation, is whether you consider this variety of creating dubbing to be acceptable. Is it the job of the translator to be faithful to the original and choose such translation technique as to make faithfulness your #1 priority, for it to sit well with the target audience as well, but not departing too much from the original? Or can you be creative to the extent of practically, sometimes very often, writing entire fragments from scratch and putting them in the Polish dubbing, where they have very little to do with the original in terms of meaning and form? Food for thought. Thank you very much.
We don't have an answer. Questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Okay. Well,
times are changing. Okay, so the situation also of the audiovisual market is changing. So I think we used to discuss, for example, different techniques like what's overlapping. So I was always thinking about English, or like share some arguments. Better to have experience with English because teenagers already know English, so they can understand it better than to sometimes. But the situation is changing. We don't know. I was just looking at the statistics. The most popular films are like Yana, which is Italian series, or Squid Game, Korean series, or Narcos, Mexican. There's no more this absolute dominance of English. So my question is, do you think that this changing of the language landscape could also change in a way our discussion or reflection or on our digital conversation? Are all these arguments valid still in this new landscape of language?
Thank you very much. And sorry, I should have spotted you in the audience. I said there were no Polish. Yes, that is a valid point, and it may very well be so that the preponderance of Netflix and the preponderance of non-English language movies that enjoy immense popularity. Another example could be La Casa de Papel, Spanish, which is extremely popular in Poland as well. Means another new wave in Polish audiovisual translation. Netflix in Poland is mostly subtitled or voiced over. There is, to the best of my knowledge, little dubbing as such, Polish dubbing on Netflix. But I agree that when English is no longer the focus, when there are other languages and other audiovisual texts enjoy immense popularity, it is natural for different people to do it. And of course, Netflix has the guidelines as well, which, if memory serves, do mention how creative you're supposed to be and how creative you're not supposed to be. So yes, you may have a point that, that this may mean another shift in Polish audiovisual translation in the future. Yeah. Yeah.
Over domestication implies the negative.
Sometimes it is. Sometimes I think that the translator has simply gone too far for the sake of naturalness and funniness. But again, this is the ethical question which was raised here several times. Are you supposed to do it? Is it not a sort of intercultural plagiarism whereby you take somebody's work, and well, it's not plagiarism as such because the author is obvious, but you take somebody's work and you mold it to your own vision of what it should be like, making too many changes. I think that if you were, there are some examples where I think the translator has gone too far and has over-domesticated. So in my opinion, sometimes it is overdoing it.
If you have a picture of a politician from another country, you cannot change, or they do it anyway.
No, this is done in fragments where the visual, the semiotic channel does not clash. So if you introduce names of Polish politicians, for example, this is not in response to British or American or Italian politicians visible. no, that wouldn't be good. So it's just references to if you make this is all done for the effect. So it's not supposed to clash with the visual, but you bring up a name of a Polish politician because they are associated with something which is loosely associated with what the original dialogue was. So this is just for the creation of effect.
Since we have attendees, participants from Lithuania, is the same case over there? I mean, is it so over domesticating the translation?
Because some companies were asking of the I believe this is some choices that we make, and I know one particular case maybe we were adding also famous names of famous people, and the company said no, this is fine. But in other cases, the company that orders the translation that encourages you that create translation, giving suggestions and they are creating letters. So sometimes it's not that the translator decides to do that.
Very interesting.
And as far as translators' visibility is concerned, I would raise a good question about that because I think our audience are not aware that the translators change so much. I have done several research with my students, and for instance, Darky, and we look at the original and the translation, and about 70% of the film was changed. But they were not aware of that before they did their research. So I'm not sure if the audience is aware that the translator is so visible. We are as researchers because we look at the original, but general public, I don't think so. And if I look at very simply at the visibility, in the Lithuanian case, I think the fact that actors that are giving their voice for the dubbing are more famous and more visible because they stand as an advertising for the audience to come. These famous actor voice this acting from to see and the fact that means if this actor voice the film, it will be funny because he's a comedian. So actors are more visible than the
Like in Korea.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I am aware that the situation in Lithuania is both the same and different. There are some differences. Some years ago, we applied for funding for a Polish-Lithuanian project in voiceover. We eventually didn't get the funding so we didn't go very far with that. But preliminary research showed that there were similarities but differences at the same time. I wasn't aware that back translation was required. It's interesting. Mm-hmm. Okay.
We could keep this discussion on and on, but it's 11:34, so 4 minutes past the time, isn't it? and now we have a well-deserved coffee break before we get into other issues like transcreation or the importance of the original and other similar issues. Thank you very much, Lucas, for your talk. Thanks. Very interesting. Very interesting. And I had read about Shrek, the Polish dubbing of Shrek, but I didn't know that this was. Sorry, so I'm looking for my mask. I don't want to bother you.
No. It's okay.
No.
Leonardo, allora Leonardo, io non ti posso vedere perché tipo la partecipazione sempre c'è dei video, quindi magari facciamo un piccolo